Welcome to our new study. We're starting a series on Paul's missionary journeys for our Sunday evening First Essentials. We're going to be looking mainly at the book of Acts every week. We're going to see how Paul and the gospel went across the Middle East and then up into Asia and eventually to the capital of the Roman Empire. Now, as I said, the main focus will be the book of Acts, but as we'll see with this evening's study, and many more, is there's other information that can be gleaned from the letters of Paul, often called epistles, where we get more information that Luke doesn't include in Acts. Luke's main focus in Acts was to show how the church was moving across the world just as Jesus commanded and foretold that they would. So Luke is interested in big picture issues, like the gospel going across the Roman Empire. He doesn't cover every single detail of the life of Paul. But from the letters and epistles of Paul, we get more information, little details that Luke would not bring up when discussing certain missionary journeys and things like that. And like I said, we'll get into one of those tonight, which is an interesting one. And let's get started. So at first, I want to go over the background of what was going on after Jesus ascended to heaven and told the apostles to start preaching the gospel. They did that, and they did that focused around Jerusalem. The church began to grow, and many Jewish Christians who lived in Jerusalem were brought to faith in Jesus Christ. They continued to meet at the temple. On the morning of Pentecost, when Peter preached his sermon, there were many Jews from all different nations under the sun who came to Jerusalem for the festival, and they were there and heard the gospel preached in their own language. There were also God-fearing Greeks there. And as these people heard the gospel preached, they joined the Christian sect or group and began to meet at the temple. And it was as if the worship of God continued, focused at the temple as it had been for centuries, but just a decidedly Jesus-focused element to that worship, that he was the fulfillment of the Old Testament and that his teachings were the fulfillment of the Old Testament law's teachings. And so what we have is this Jewish Christianity, and it continues in Jerusalem. Now, a man named Saul, so Saul is his Jewish name and Paul is his Roman name, is in Jerusalem at this time. Now, Saul, he is not a Christian, obviously. He's a Pharisee. He does not like this new group of Christ followers. He does not want them to increase as they are. There's now several thousand of them. And he begins to set himself against them along with some other leading Pharisees. So let's talk a little bit about what is a Pharisee. I know we use it as an insult today. We'll say that guy over there, he's a Pharisee. We mean he has a lot of rules that he tries to make other people follow. Maybe he's legalistic. What is a Pharisee? Now, in the Jewish religious world, pre-Christianity, so we're talking about during the time of Jesus, before the church was formed, there were three major Jewish groups. We call them political parties. Number one were the Sadducees. The Sadducees lived in the big cities. They were richer. They were more affluent. They were in positions of power in the government. The chief priest and many of the council members were Sadducees. And the Sadducees, we might call them theologically liberal. They did not believe that there was life after death. They were probably influenced by Greek philosophy for this. They accepted the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, but they didn't really honor and cherish the rest of the Old Testament. And many of them had left in heart and practice the religion of Judaism. They might follow the day of sacrifice, they might follow the rules, but they were not as strict observers of that as many other Jewish religious groups were. The Sadducees were more numerous than the Pharisees, but the Pharisees are who we mainly meet in the Bible when we read through the books of the Gospels, because they were the ones out in the villages. They were the ones out in the countryside. They worked amongst the people. We can actually admire them for this. They realized if you wanted to teach the Word of God, you had to leave this big capital city of Jerusalem, all its political importance and money, and get out in the countryside where the people were to teach them the law. The Pharisees loved the law and they wanted everyone to know it. In fact, they loved it so much that they viewed it as so vital for the survival of the nation that they built more rules around it to keep the people from breaking it. So they looked at the Old Testament and they said, God exiled Israel from the land after the Babylonians took Jerusalem because they broke the law and they had idolatry in their hearts and they weren't following the Torah. What can we do to help these people follow it better? So they said, well, we'll make more rules to keep them from even getting close to breaking it. So if you could imagine the Grand Canyon, and if you fall off the cliff, that's a sin. The people would get right up the edge and look over the edge of the Grand Canyon, and the Pharisees were scared they would stumble and fall. So they said, we have a good idea. Let's put a fence up 50 feet from the Grand Canyon so that nobody can even get close to the edge. That's how they viewed the law of Moses. So whereas the law of Moses would say, don't eat an unclean animal, they would say, okay, so everybody has to strain their drink through a cheesecloth so that a gnat, a tiny little gnat, doesn't accidentally get in your sweet tea, which it wasn't sweet tea back then, and you accidentally drink it and get unclean. So they made laws to keep you from breaking the big laws. The other one was if you touched a dead body, you were unclean for a while. They said, we can't have people touching dead bodies. They might accidentally fall through a grave and land on somebody's bones. So let's go with white paint and brightly paint all of the tombs and graves. Not because they're wanting to honor the dead, but because they're wanting to keep people from falling inadvertently in a tomb and becoming unclean. So they made laws to keep people from breaking the real law of God. The Pharisees loved rules, and they would come up with all kinds of rules for the Sabbath, rules for washing your hands, rules for this, rules for that. But they were zealous. They were zealous that you would not break the law and bring down wrath on Israel. So let me tell you what Paul describes himself as when he describes himself as a Pharisee in the book of Galatians. In the book of Galatians, chapter 1, Paul is talking about his life before Christ. He says in chapter 1, verse 13, for you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, so extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. He was zealous that the Jewish people not break the law. When he saw these Christians with new ideas about worship, new ideas about the Sabbath, new ideas about sacrifice, and even new ideas about what God was saying in the Old Testament, it was an insult to his heritage, and he wanted to destroy it. The Bible said he was violently persecuting it. So that was Paul, the Pharisee. The third group of Jewish political parties or religious parties were the Essenes, and they did not like the temple. They thought it was corrupt because the Sadducees were so bad to them, and the Sadducees didn't accept God's word, so they believed the temple was corrupt. They lived out in the desert in communes. They believed in a form of asceticism, getting away from the world, getting away from luxury. They copied the scriptures. Their followers are who wrote down and hid the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were also politically violent at times and wanted to violently overthrow the Roman government. John the Baptist was not an Essene, but his way of life, living out in the wilderness and ministering there, is very similar to what they practiced. Jesus, as you know, most of his interactions were out in the Galilean countryside amongst the people, and it involved his conflicts with the Pharisees. And so we know more about them from the Bible just because that's who Jesus ran into a lot of the time. So the next thing I want to talk about is the synagogue. What is a synagogue? A synagogue is a Jewish meeting place, we might call it a church, where they would meet on the Sabbath. And the elder trained men of the congregation would be able to read from the Old Testament. Perhaps somebody would expound on it, explain it to the people, and they would, it was the central meeting place of Jewish religious life. Now, the temple was for sacrifice. The temple was for the festivals and the ordinances, but as a Jewish person living out in the countryside, your synagogue was the main way you connected with God's people, like the church today. And the Christian church grew up in synagogues. There were groups within the synagogue who would follow Jesus, Nazarenes. And they were part of the Jewish synagogue. They didn't have a separate church at first. That's where they met. They continued Jewish religious life even as Jewish Christians. So as you see, Jewish Christianity really was a part of Judaism for a while. But then this event happened. And I want y'all to turn to Acts chapter 9. Knowing this background, we're going to look. I want you to read chapter 9 of Acts. I want you to look at what Saul does here and how the church reacts. We're going to come back and talk about it. Well, as you read chapter 9, you saw the martyrdom of Stephen and the beginning of general, widespread Jewish persecution of the Christian community in the Jewish synagogue. So Stephen, as you know, a deacon, strong in the faith, and he preaches a sermon during his trial that incenses and enrages the Jewish religious leaders around him. So when you look through chapter 9, you get to this point where after the martyrdom of Stephen, Saul is continuing the persecution that he started. Because remember, the men laid their cloaks down at the feet of Saul during their execution of Stephen. This was showing that he was the one who was in charge and who was answering for this act. So Paul, he's angry, he wants to destroy the church, and he gets these letters from the chief priests introducing him and giving him authority over these synagogue meetings. And he hears there's a lot of Christians in Damascus. It's a hotbed of their heresy. You need to go there. He wants to go there, and he wants to root them out, kick them out, have them excommunicated, perhaps have them brought back and thrown in prison. He is on the road to do damage to the church. And so what we see with Saul is that he is fulfilling the role of an inquisitor. You know, we hear about the inquisitors from the Spanish Inquisition. They were people from the Roman Catholic Church at the time who'd go out in the villages and go out and interrogate people, trying to find wrong beliefs so they could punish these people. He was an inquisitor in Judaism. But as he is going along, a light falls from heaven. I almost imagine a thunderbolt around him, throwing him to the ground, and he speaks to him. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Not why are you persecuting the church, but look, the Lord identifies us with his own body. Why are you persecuting me? And so Saul can only say back, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, but rise and enter the city, and you'll be told what you are to do. Saul knew he was in trouble. And so he goes into the city of Damascus. A disciple named Ananias restores his sight, and Saul becomes a Christian, a Nazarene. He begins following the way. I'm going to read a passage to you from this book. It's by John Pollock. It's called Apostle, The Life of Paul. I had to read it for seminary when I was going through New Testament, and interesting book on, a lot of it is kind of, they speculate some of the details, that aren't filled in from the Bible, what they might have been. But it does have a lot of very good historical information in the book. And so if you're interested in learning more about it, more about this time and more about Paul, it would be a pretty good book for you to pick up. And he talks about what it must have been like that morning. The Jewish religious leaders are in their synagogue and they're ready for this guy to come from Jerusalem. He's going to be here this Saturday and he's going to set us straight. So I'm going to read from the book. An even more extraordinary incident occurred next Sabbath at the most important of the numerous Damascus synagogues. So there are many synagogues in Damascus, big city. The elders and congregation had no idea of Paul's conversion. He had not disclosed it even to the leader of the synagogue. They merely supposed he'd recovered from his sickness and was ready to work. They had gossiped about that since the announcement of his arrival. The stricter members, as they took their seats, expressed pious satisfaction that heresy would be erased. The cruel members had pleasurable anticipation of possible bloodletting. They wanted to see some Christians get executed. The Nazarenes, however, who knew the affair would develop differently, were praying for Saul. When the leader escorted him to the dais, still dressed like any Pharisee in his blue-fringed robe with a leather amulet on his turban, he was handed the scroll of the law. He read aloud the assigned passage for the day, each inflection correct, and returned the scroll to the attendant. In the moment's pause before he began to preach, he marveled at God's providence. During the past century, synagogues had spread in countless Gentile cities, ready for the day that Jesus would be preached across the Roman Empire. If only they could see the truth, they would believe too. Then and there he proclaimed, Jesus is the Son of God. Paul charged into his sermon with the same vehemence and abandon that he had charged into his persecution. Words tumbled out as he told how the Lord had met him. The Lord was alive again and loved them all. The reaction was not at all as he had hoped and expected. The worshipers were stunned and aghast. Far from being convinced, they were angry. This turncoat, received as the high priest's representative, had now declared himself representative of Jesus. As the book of Acts tells us, Paul's first sermon was not well received. He preaches that Jesus is the Son of God, but the Jews are angry. It says in verse 21, and all who heard him were amazed. And that doesn't mean like, oh, wow. That means, like, what? They're shocked. They're angry. And said, is not this the man who made havoc in Jerusalem and of those who called upon this name? And has he not come here for this purpose, to bring them bound before the chief priest? But Saul increased all the more in strength and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Christ. Now, Luke says, when many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, but their plot became known to Saul. What he doesn't tell you, because remember, Acts is not interested in all the details. It's the big picture. But if we go to Galatians chapter 1 again, Paul gives some details that Luke doesn't include. In verse 16 of chapter 1, Galatians, he says, and when Jesus was pleased, or God was pleased to reveal his Son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. So Paul went from Damascus to Arabia. Now, Arabia is, you think of Saudi Arabia, but that wasn't what Arabia was back then. Arabia was that desert to the east of the Jordan River Valley. It was mainly uninhabited, and there was a trade route going down to the kingdom of Nabatea, the Nabatean kingdom. Many of you have heard of the city of Petra. It's located right there in the middle of it. That's the city with the ornate palaces carved into the cliff faces. It's like the rock, mountainous hideout, capital city of the Nabatean kingdom. And there were trade routes. They hid in the rocks from the Romans. They hid from about anybody. They were very smart people. They could live in the desert, and the caravans passed right through there going down to Egypt and going north to the rest of the Roman Empire. So that was what was known as Arabia, and Paul went down there, and we believe, he doesn't fill in details, that he ministered amongst the Nabateans and the trade routes, because he does say he was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. We know that he would have taken any opportunity to preach, but most of what he was doing there, we think, was looking at the Old Testament, studying it. After he'd been saved, he had to unlearn the way in which he read the Old Testament as a Pharisee. He had to learn how to read it, to find Christ revealed in the Old Testament, how to find the true meaning of what God wanted from your heart as a worshiper, not just following the letter of the law, but the spirit of it, having it written on your heart. We believe that in those 3 years, Paul prepared himself to preach Christ from the scriptures instead of preach Phariseeism from the scriptures. So Paul, gone for 3 years, he's learning, he's possibly having visions from Jesus, because he does say in Galatians, he did not learn this gospel from man, but by revelation of Jesus Christ. Some people say that means just him meeting him on the road to Damascus. Others say, we think during that time in Arabia, Jesus appeared to him and would teach him. So we don't know for sure. He doesn't fill in all the details. I lean to say that I think he had visions, because he talks about having visions, that God revealed truth to him through the Old Testament and taught him. But those 3 years, he is in Arabia. Then he returns back to Damascus. He begins preaching Jesus and confounding the Jews, just showing that they don't even know their own scriptures. And in Acts chapter 9, it says what happens. We know that Saul had been there, he was preaching, and what ends up happening is he runs into persecution. The same persecution he brought against the Christians is now brought against him, and the Jews decide this man must die. So at the end of chapter 9, in chapter 9, verse 23, when many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him. Their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night in order to kill him, but his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. He gets let out basically through an ancient garbage disposal, a basket dropped from the city walls. So he escapes, and we'll follow up next week with what he does next. But what can we learn from the conversion of Saul and his first post in ministry, preaching in Damascus? Well, we can learn that Jesus can save and use anyone. This guy was a murderer and a blasphemer, as he describes himself. He did not love Jesus. He opposed the way, but Jesus saved him and immediately put him into his service. Jesus can save and use anyone. Second, study is good and necessary. Even someone as brilliant as Paul, who knew the Old Testament scriptures, for 3 years after his conversion, we believe, went and studied, relearning how to read them properly and find Jesus revealed in the Old Testament. And it equipped him for the rest of his public ministry. Number 3, persecution doesn't stop the gospel. It didn't stop the gospel when Paul was trying to kill it. In fact, the gospel bit back and got Paul, changed him and made him one of the most eloquent advocates for Jesus ever. But also, even this week, or even at the end of this lesson, when we learned that Paul had to run from persecution, it does not stop the gospel. As it said, his disciples hid him. He left trained men behind in that city who could continue to preach Jesus after he was gone. So I hope you enjoy learning about the Apostle Paul. We miss you, praying for you, and hope you have a great Lord's Day. God bless.